some Christians have one simple answer for everything. Doesn't matter what problem you present to them, they've got one-line answer for everything. They'll just tell you, and you know what they're going to say before they say it, just pray about it. Just pray about it. That's the answer for everything. It's not easy to pray when your mind is confused. If you can't think straight, you can't pray straight.
Welcome to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith. I'm David Pick. Thanks for being with us today. And Colin, I'm glad you're talking about this today because that answer just seems so unhelpful sometimes. There are times in our lives when we're really not sure how to pray, when we're feeling so overwhelmed.
And of course, these words can be said as wise counsel.
But it can also be a kind of flippant response, right?
The Bible is such a wonderful book. Here we are in Psalm 73, where we've got a godly man who is really struggling. And he knows that he can't actually pray very well because the whole point of his struggle is that he's got real questions about God. How you talk to God when you're in this confusion where you say, I don't know what's happening. And Psalm 73, which was written after God brought him through this experience, charts how God turned him around. And it didn't begin with prayer. It ended with prayer, but it didn't begin with prayer. It began somewhere else. We're going to see where it began and how it progressed in the program today.
So join us today, if you can, in Psalm 73 as we begin the message, Think. Here's Colin.
Well, please keep your Bibles open at Psalm 73 as we continue through this marvelous personal story together. It's really the testimony of a man called Asaph. And remember, he was a good man. He was a mature believer. In fact, he was in full-time ministry. He was a Levite, and he had been called to minister before the ark of God. But as we saw last time, he came to a place in his life where he was facing some major problems. He couldn't make sense of what God was doing in the world. He couldn't make sense of what God was doing in his own life, and therefore he'd come to the conclusion that he could no longer see the point in continuing to pursue a godly life. And looking back on this crisis, he writes this psalm under the inspiration of the Spirit, and he shares with other believers, with us today, his story. He's saying to us, I almost gave up. If I had followed where my mind and my heart was going at that particularly dark time of my life, I have to tell you, I would have let everybody down. I would have betrayed your children. That's what he says, and that's where we got to last time in verse 15. Now, the marvelous thing, as we've seen already, is that God turned this man around. God brought Asaph through this crisis, and he's able to do the same thing for you. We've been saying that Asaph made a 5-point turn, and we're coming to the second point of that this morning. Last week we saw, remember, that the turn began for this man when he made a decision. And that decision was to be loyal to the Lord and his people. I will not betray your children. That was his decision. And when he stopped dead in his tracks, he would no longer follow where his mind was taking him. He committed himself to loyalty to God and to his people. That's where the change began. And we learned last week that really the first step in turning your life around is not finding an answer to your questions. God often calls us to live without answers to our questions. The first step is not finding an answer to your questions. The first step is to make a decision. And that's why we pictured our friend Asaph, who we met last time, holding a stop sign, because that word stop really summed up in one word the whole of last week's message. Turning your life around begins when you stop. You make a decision. I will not betray the Lord. Now, today's message is also summed up in one word. I want to keep this nice and easy so we can remember. Stop was last week. One word for this week, think. Think. Now let's look at verse 16 as we move forward together. When I tried to understand all this, he says, that's all the problem and all the questions that were going on in his mind, it was oppressive to me. I looked at these problems in my life. I looked at the problems in the world, And my mind went round and round and round and round and round. I was awake at night. Why is this happening? I was saying to myself. It was oppressive to me. I couldn't break free from it. I just couldn't get out. Oppressive. Now, it's a terrible thing when your mind is confused. It goes round and round and round in circles. And the second step in Asaph's recovery, the second point of his turn, was that God straightened out the confused thinking that reigned in this man's mind. Stop, think. Now, how's that going to happen? How does confused thinking that sometimes reigns in our minds get straightened out? I was helped and intrigued by a comment of Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones on this. He points out that some Christians have one simple answer for everything. Doesn't matter what problem you present to them, they've got one-line answer for everything. They'll just tell you, and you know what they're going to say before they say it, just pray about it. Just pray about it. Just pray about it. That's the answer for everything. Lloyd-Jones points out, surely rightly, it's not easy to pray when your mind is confused. If you can't think straight, you can't pray straight. So frankly, when someone says to you or says to me at a point when we're really confused, hey, just pray about it, it's not a lot of help, and you know that, and so do I. Well, Asaph's going to tell us what did turn his thinking around. What did bring him to the place where he could pray meaningfully and clearly. I got to tell you, I found this so practical, so helpful in my own life and experience, and my prayer in coming to this today is that God will use this to bring help and encouragement and the straightening out of confused thinking in our minds and in our hearts today. Look at what Asaph says. When I tried to understand all this, it was oppressive to me till I entered the sanctuary of God. Now, Asaph lived at the time of David, and the sanctuary, of course, was the place of worship at that time. Remember, the temple was not built until the days of Solomon, and Asaph's before that time. The sanctuary was where David put the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark of the Covenant was, of course, a large wooden box that was carried on poles, and by the time of David, it was nearly 500 years old. The significance of the Ark of the Covenant, which of course had been constructed in the time of Moses when the people were in the wilderness, was that this was where God had said he would meet with his people. So when God's people were traveling in the wilderness, now nearly 500 years previously, by the time of Asaph, they carried the ark with them. When they came into the promised land, they carried the ark with them. They came to meet with God when they were in the promised land at the place where David put the ark that was in this tent-like structure called the sanctuary in Jerusalem. Of course, nobody ever saw the ark. You remember that. It was kept behind a curtain. So Asaph didn't actually see it, even although he was called to minister in front of it. But the point is that when he went into the sanctuary was the place where the ark was. He knew it was there. The ark was behind the curtain. Actually, that's God teaching us in pictures again, because we draw near to God. We don't see him, but we know that he's there. And God was teaching his people that they could be sure and confident of his presence, even when they couldn't see him, with this imagery of the ark where his presence was promised that was hidden behind the curtain. And of course, that old ark could tell a few stories from the last 500 years. Constructed in the wilderness, carried onto the field of battle, captured once by God's enemies who were absolutely terrified when they saw what happened when they got hold of it. Abandoned on a farm during the lean years of Saul, now it had been brought back to Jerusalem and placed in the sanctuary. It was a box, but it contained three things. You know what was in the Ark of the Covenant? The tablets of stone on which God had written the Ten Commandments by his own finger. A golden pot that was filled with manna, a great reminder of how God provided for his people and brought them through the driest and deadest of times in the wilderness. Aaron's rod that budded, a reminder that God is the God of miracles and that God has opened a way through the high priest for us to come to peace with him. The ark, in other words, told the story of the promises, the provision, and the presence of God for his people through the centuries in every circumstance of life. Now, there's something very important for us to grasp here. Asaph's confused. He's got all kinds of unanswered questions that are running through his mind. Things are going wrong in his life. His mind needs to be straightened out by the truth. And he's telling us, that's what happened when I came into the sanctuary. Coming to worship is not escaping from your problems. It's coming into an environment where you are faced with God's truth in such a way that you'll be strengthened to face your problems. Coming to worship is not like going to the cinema, where you get about 2 hours relief by being drawn into a temporary kind of world, and then you have to go back to reality again. No, coming to worship is coming into the place where your thinking is changed in such a way that you can go out to face the world in a way that you couldn't have done so before. Now, of course, there are a lot of folks who have the idea that Christianity is really just about aesthetics, that it's about a kind of emotional crutch. This is why Karl Marx said that religion is the what? The opiate of the people. And frankly, in many cases, he was right. That's how many people use Christianity. They've never really understood what it is. But we do not come to worship for some kind of opiate. We're doing what Asaph does. We come into the sanctuary. We come into the place where we find the presence of God in order to find strength to face the realities of life as our confused thinking gets straightened out by his truth.
You're listening to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith and a message called Think, part of our series I Almost Gave Up, all about Asaph's story from Psalm 73. And if you ever miss one of our series, you can always catch up or go back and listen again online at our website, openthebible.org.uk. Open the Bible is supported by our listeners, and this month, as every month, we have a special offer if you want to start supporting Open the Bible financially. Later on in the programme, I'll be talking to Pastor Colin Smith about this month's special offer, so I hope you'll stay with us. Back to the message now. Here again is Pastor Colin.
Coming to worship is coming into the place where your thinking is changed in such a way that you can go out to face the world in a way that you couldn't have done so before. We're doing what Asaph does. We come into the sanctuary. We come into the place where we find the presence of God in order to find strength to face the realities of life as our confused thinking gets straightened out by his truth. Now let's see how that happened for Asaph. It's a wonderful story. Here's the first thing, that as he came into the sanctuary, what he was doing, of course, was remembering God's truth. That is the significance of the ark. The ark was the reminder that God had been walking with his people for 500 years, and in fact more than that before the time of the ark as well. Here's Asaph, and he's so consumed with these burning questions of what's going on in his own life, he comes into the sanctuary, he sees he's part of something much bigger. God has brought his people through the wilderness. God has kept his people alive in the desert. God brought his people into the land of Canaan and overcame powerful enemies. He has kept his people, he has protected his people, he has guided his people, he has preserved his people, he has sustained his people from generation to generation. And now Asaph comes near to the same ark of God. And he takes his place as a worshipper in this great line of succession. And he remembers that this God is now with him. That's life-changing. I want to read a few lines from one of my very favorite authors, James Denney. He says this: "We need the common faith to sustain our individual faith. We need the consciousness of the children of God in all ages to fortify our wavering belief." And then he says, to be at home in the church is to absorb this strength unconsciously. And I love this next bit. It is to be delivered from the shallows and the miseries of a too narrow experience, and to be set afloat on the broad stream of Christian conviction which gathers impetus and volume with every generation the saints survive. You see, there's not just your faith, there's our faith. There's not just your experience, there's our experience. There's not just your testimony, there's our testimony. And not just our testimony here in this little capsule of time, but our testimony as part of the testimony of the whole Church of Jesus Christ that's now been going for 2,000 years. You know, it's a great blessing to be part of the body of Christ. There is nothing in your life that God's people have not faced before. There are no questions in your mind that have not been asked before. People have lived and died on the promises of God for 2,000 years. No testing, says the Apostle Paul, has come to you except that which is common to man. There's nothing unique about your pain or mine. To be delivered from the shallows and the miseries of too narrow an experience, says Denney, and to be set afloat on the broad stream of Christian conviction. That's what happens when we gather together in worship, when the church on earth joins with the church in heaven, and I see coming out of my little world that I'm actually part of something far bigger that is in the hand of God. Remember God's truth. Here's the second thing that happened when he came into the sanctuary. What would you expect him to find in the sanctuary? Well, the ark and people. Meet with God's people. Remember God's truth? Meet with God's people. That'll straighten your thinking out. The encouragement of God's people is one of the great means that God uses to strengthen us when we feel like giving up. By the way, that is why you should never withdraw from God's people when you're discouraged. See, when we become discouraged, there is a certain impetus that says, hey, I'll just stay home. I'm not going to come to worship. No, I'll just withdraw. And isolation is your greatest danger when you're discouraged. You need others around you. We all do. And Asaph does the right thing. He not only goes to a sanctuary where he finds the presence of the ark that speaks to him of God's faithfulness over generations, he comes to the place where he's going to meet with others who share the same faith and are able to encourage and strengthen one another in God. God will use his people to bring strength and encouragement to you. And sometimes that will happen in the most unexpected of ways. Let me speak personally. Let me tell you how God blessed me last Sunday. Dick Bender. Dick's one of our senior members. He's been through very extensive surgery. He's a man of extraordinary courage. Last Sunday, we just finished the third service. I had my coat on, was about to head out through the main entrance there, head off home. Got to the front door of the church, and Dick was there with his stick, about to leave. I hadn't seen him or spoken to him for quite a while. I said how good it was to see him at church after all that he'd been through. And he made some comment about just keep pressing on. I held the door for him. said goodbye, and walked across the car park. And here's what I was thinking. If he can do what he's doing after all that he's been through, what in the world do I have to complain about? Actually, I think God was speaking to me through Dick. And he knew nothing about it. The truth is, I've thought about him 4 or 5 times in the last week. I've thanked God for his testimony. And I've drawn encouragement from the example of a man who just keeps struggling on, who wants to be here in worship despite great difficulties. He loves Christ and he just keeps pressing on. So I'll tell you, I'm really glad that Dick made the effort to come to church last Sunday. I don't know what it did for him, but I know what he did for me.
An encouraging word there from Colin, that we can come right into God's sanctuary as we begin to get our lives back on track. You've been listening to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith and a message called Think, part of our series I Almost Gave Up, based on Psalm 73 and Asaph's story. If you ever miss one of our series, you can always go back and listen again online at our website, openthebible.org.uk. Or you can find us as a podcast, and those are on all the main podcast sites. Search for Open the Bible UK, or follow the link from our website. Open the Bible is supported by our listeners, so if you already give to support the work, thank you so much. If that's something you'd like to begin to do, this month we have a wonderful offer for you. If you're able to set up a new direct debit to the work of Open the Bible in the amount of £5 per month or more, or a one-off gift of £50 or more, we'll say thank you by sending you our Easter giveaway bundle. In the bundle are 2 copies of the new graphic novel version of Heaven, How I Got Here, Pastor Colin Smith's account of the thief on the cross. And in addition, a copy of the NIV Outreach Bible. These items are ideal to give away to family or friends this Easter. Colin, what is the one thing that you would like people to take away from this new graphic novel?
Well, it would be that when God draws near, he comes to give us what we do not have. That's the message of grace, and it's the greatest good news in all of the world. You know, C.H. Spurgeon used to tell a story about a pastor who took money one day to an old lady who was in great need. And he knocked on the door and she didn't answer. And eventually the pastor went home. He saw her the next Sunday and he said, well, I came with a gift to your home. And she said, oh, when did you come? And he told her, and she said, oh, I heard you knock on the door, but I didn't open the door because I thought you were the man coming to collect the rent. Now, you see, I think that that's where many people are. They have this idea that if God draws near, he's calling for the rent. He's coming to demand something from us. There are millions of people who have never understood grace, and their whole idea of Christianity is that they're going to be told what they need to do and what they need to be, and they don't have either the desire or the ability to do it. And the story of the thief on the cross just blows that out of the water. Here's this person who has not lived a life that has been pleasing to God at all. And instead of coming with a demand, the Lord Jesus Christ gives the most marvelous gift. He opens heaven for this man who believes. So here's an opportunity with a graphic novel, a simple pictorial presentation of this marvelous story of God's compelling grace. You could put it into people's hands. We'd love to see this graphic novel getting into the hands of as many people as possible, people who need to understand grace. A younger person in your family, someone who is trying to live a good life but really hasn't understood the heart of the gospel. You could be the means of getting a simple presentation of God's grace into their hands. Would love to encourage you to do that and hope that this graphic novel will be useful to you in that regard.
Well, we'd love to send you 2 copies of this graphic novel, Heaven, How I Got Here, the story of the thief on the cross, along with an NIV Outreach Bible, ideal to give away to friends and family this Easter. Full details, terms and conditions on our website openthebible.org.uk, and you can give online. But if you do give online, don't forget to leave your full name and address so we can send you the Easter giveaway bundle. For Pastor Colin Smith and Open the Bible, I'm David Pick, and I hope you'll join us again next time. The Bible tells us that God has placed the wicked on slippery ground. Really? How does he do that? Find out next time on Open the Bible.